What's up, Joe? What's up, everybody? Welcome to another edition of Sports360. I'm your host, Jeff Fannell, and today I will be joined by attorney and sports consultant Chris Cipolla to talk about the recent Supreme Court decision that overturned the federal ban on state-sponsored sports betting. It's a landmark decision that presents a number of interesting and intricate legal, political, and practical issues. You won't want to miss this one. So keep it right here, a discussion on sports gambling on Sports 360. Well, it's my pleasure today to welcome Chris Cipolla of Excalibur Sports. He's joining us here on the podcast. Excalibur is located in Manhasset, New York, and they provide a host of legal, business, and consulting services to sports teams, leagues, and individuals in the professional sports space. Chris is a licensed attorney, and he's also one of the principals at Excalibur. And he's here today to talk with us about the recent Supreme Court gambling decision that has the sports world abuzz. Chris, how you doing today?
Great, Jeff. Thanks for having me.
Sure. I'm glad to have you here to talk about this because obviously the Supreme Court's decision that overturned the general ban against sports betting in the United States is something that has gotten a lot of people's attention. In fact, the decision was handed down May 14th.
That's correct.
And in that decision, the Supreme Court ruled that the Professional and Amateur Sports Protection Act, which we're going to just say PASPA from this point forward, was unconstitutional. That's the 1992 legislation that largely prohibited state-sponsored sports betting with a few exceptions. And that decision now has opened the way for states to legalize sports betting. And, Chris, I'm glad to have you on so you can sort of discuss the ins and outs of that decision and what it means going forward. So why don't we start here? Why don't we start with you giving us a thumbnail summary of the litigation, discussing
Sure.
PASPA a little bit first, what happened in terms of New Jersey challenging the act, and then taking us up through the Supreme Court decision.
Sure, no problem. So it goes back to 2011 when it comes to New Jersey and their fight to legalize sports betting within the state. The legislation at issue, as you mentioned, was the Professional and Amateur Sports Protection Act of 1992, which has become commonly known as PASPA. And PASPA was enacted at that time to stop the spread of state-sponsored sports betting. You mentioned grandfathered states. Nevada has full-fledged sports betting. They have for decades and continued to. Delaware was also part of that group, as well as Montana and Oregon. They offered different products. It wasn't full-fledged sports betting. But when it came to New Jersey in 2011, New Jersey residents approved a referendum overwhelmingly late November, in November of 2011, by a 2-to-1 margin to legalize sports betting within their state. 2012, Governor Christie, who was the governor at the time, signed into law the bill legalizing sports betting, which allowed legalized and regulated sports betting at racetracks and casinos within the state of New Jersey. At that time, the leagues sued to enjoin New Jersey from enacting that legislation, saying that it violated PASPA. And the professional sports leagues won, and the NCAA won that litigation at every step. And the Supreme Court denied cert in that case. That gave rise to what's become commonly known as Christie 2. The first litigation was Christie 1. And in Christie 2, what New Jersey did with the takeaway they went back to the drawing board, so to say, and they decided to, instead of licensing and regulating sports betting, their takeaway from the case, from the things that were said by the attorneys for the leagues and the NCAA, as well as the Third Circuit decision, they believed that they could essentially decriminalize sports betting at racetracks and casinos, and they would not run afoul of PASPA. So instead of, proactively going out and looking to regulate it, they're just going to decriminalize it at those locations, and they should be permitted to offer sports betting. The leagues and NCAA sued New Jersey. New Jersey lost it every step of the way again, but this time the Supreme Court granted cert, and they took the case over the Inspector General's advice to not take the case, which was also just another tidbit along the way of the hurdle that was overcome to get to that hearing. And ultimately, the Supreme Court ruled by a 6-3, 7-2 margin based on how you read the opinions and the concurrence and the dissent, that PASPA was unconstitutional. It violated the 10th Amendment, which deals with the federal government commandeering rights that belong to the states. And that's how we ended up where we are today, with New Jersey winning that case. PASPA was declared unconstitutional. It was invalidated. And that's where we sit today, with all the states that are looking to legalize, proposing legislation and having their hearings.
Right. Now, on that last point, Chris, I know in conversations you and I have had, you have made a point of correcting the record, so to speak, because a lot of people have said, or it's been written, that the Supreme Court's decision legalized sports betting in the states, and you said that's not quite right. Can you explain that?
Yes, that's correct, and that was there have been a lot of misconceptions since the court ruled, because like you mentioned early on, there's a lot more attention on this subject now. One of the common misconceptions you hear is that sports betting is now legal. It's not legal. What Justice Alito wrote for the majority of the court was that, and it's actually an interesting line because it brings the federal government back into it. But what he wrote was, Congress can regulate sports betting directly, but if it elects not to do so, each state is free to act on its own behalf. Right now, you have states that are entertaining legalizing sports betting. Congress still can act, and there's talk about Congress getting involved and having hearings in late June to potentially address. So at this point, it's up to the states to act to legalize sports betting, and unless your state does so, sports betting will remain illegal within your borders.
So now give us the current landscape, because I believe in the past week or so, Delaware has gone full-fledged with sports betting, and there are a number of states that are positioned to do so and others who are considering doing so. Can you give us a little bit of the landscape as it exists among the states right now? Absolutely.
So Nevada is obviously the state that has been and will continue to offer a full wagering menu. In addition to Nevada, one of the other grandfathered states under PASPA, Delaware, you are correct that last Tuesday, they started taking single game wagers and went to a more Nevada, Las Vegas style wagering menu. So prior to that, it was only NFL parlay wagers. Now they have a much closer menu to Nevada than previously. New Jersey is the next state that will most likely have sports books up and running within the state. Their Senate and Assembly unanimously passed legislation last Thursday to legalize sports betting. The bill is currently, as we sit here today, on the governor's desk, Governor Murphy. He has not signed the bill into law as of yet. That's caused some people to be upset in New Jersey, thinking that this should have happened quickly. I believe that they were hoping to have sports books up and running over the weekend. That did not happen. So, once he signs the bill into law, New Jersey will be the third state to have full-fledged sports betting. And outside of New Jersey, West Virginia has passed legislation, Mississippi as well. They need to adopt regulations, and that should happen by football season. So I would expect those to be the next two. New York, potentially, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Pennsylvania has passed legislation. So there are states jockeying for position as we currently speak. But I would think by the fall, you'd probably have, when it comes to what is viewed as a full wagering menu in Nevada, New Jersey, Delaware, and West Virginia and or Mississippi.
Now, as more states get into legalized sports betting, I would imagine that the state of Nevada probably is the most unhappy about the developments. Would that be a correct assumption? Because again, I mean, for years, right, they've been the only, they've been the only state with a full-fledged sports book. So I would imagine that the state of Nevada looks at this and probably is not too happy with the developments. Is that a correct assumption, you think?
Depends who you speak to. Nevada, sports betting as a whole is viewed as a low margin business. When you talk to casino operators and people in the gaming industry, sports betting is used as a draw into the property, and then money is spent elsewhere. Rooms, restaurants, other, higher margin gaming. If you look at reports from the Nevada Gaming Commission, the margins on slot machines are very high. So, I think that when it comes to the gaming industry in Nevada as a whole, I don't think that they're that concerned about it. You can look back to when, there was a time when casinos weren't in every state, and the proliferation of casinos being operated across the country really hasn't negatively impacted Nevada. Las Vegas is viewed as Las Vegas. It's unique. There's more than just one, facet to going to Las Vegas. It's not just about the casino. There's a lot going on there. So I don't think the gaming industry as a whole is going to be negatively impacted or necessarily that concerned. I do think that when it comes to, the sports book operations, clearly they'll take what the hit will be. Maybe you don't have everybody go out to Nevada for March Madness or the Super Bowl like they do currently. But I don't know that they're necessarily overly concerned about the impact. I think that it will force, and this is where it will be interesting what states are more progressive with their legislation. I think it will force Nevada to evolve and sort of update their regulations, so to say, when it comes to depositing, mobile deposits, the mobile products that are offered. So that will be interesting to see if they, sort of become a little more progressive now that there is more regulated competition. But I think overall the gaming industry is not concerned. They don't look at it as a negative to the state and the industry.
Fair enough. Let me ask you this question, because this is something that over the years, as I've had conversations with colleagues in other countries, particularly countries in Europe, they've often remarked to me that they did not understand why the United States was so against sports gambling, because sports gambling has been going on in Europe for years. What's your view of that? Is it the corruption concern here in the United States, transparency issues? Historically, what has been the issue for the states or for this country overall when it comes to sports betting?
I think that you look at the landscape and when PASPA was enacted. Yeah, of course, integrity issues are always at the forefront, and I think that was probably what was the biggest concern when it comes to the spread of sports betting. You're right. It's just woven into the everyday life of people in London, in the UK. So the idea that it's not legal here, but it goes on offshore, and it's basically everybody knows that sports betting takes place, but it was only legal in Nevada and limited in Delaware. It's confusing when you look at it. When you take a 30,000-foot view of the laws in this state, in this country, it is confusing. And I think that the paramount concern was always integrity of the game issues. But I think we got to a point where when you really looked at where we stood, and again, 1992 was much different than 2018. And when you look at 2018 and what goes on in the proliferation of the offshore sportsbook industry, as well as the local bookie that it seems everybody knows somebody that they can place a wager through, you kind of wonder. It's just as much a part, it seems, as everyday life here. It just hasn't been in a transparent, regulated space. So I understand, when you talk to people outside of this country, that there may be, some confusion as to why we have the landscape. And I think that now we'll end up eventually. I don't think it will be quickly, but I do think we're headed towards, a system that is much more in line with what you see in the UK.
Now let's transition a little bit, Chris, to what we might expect as states begin to move into the space and legalize gambling. What's your prediction in terms of how this is going to look? Are fans and others going to be able to bet on all sports? Do you anticipate there'll be some sports like college sports and others that might be off limits? What do you see happening here?
As we currently look at the landscape, it's going to depend state by state and what they're comfortable with and what the regulators are comfortable with and what they're not. There's been talk about exempting college events. I haven't seen that play out, but there were rumblings to take the college events out of the space. I'm not sure that that's the best way to go about it, knowing that especially college football and college basketball are huge sports for sports bettors. If you just look to Nevada, that it's going on offshore. I tend to believe that having that in the regulated space makes more sense. You can more closely monitor for integrity related issues, match fixing, point shaving. But it's something that's been talked about, exempting certain college events where the contest takes place within the state or deals with a school that's located within the state. That's been talked about for many years. In Nevada, you could not wager on Nevada Reno or UNLV games. That's changed. You now can in Nevada. So I think each state, it will be a feeling out process as to what's offered, what the menu looks like, and one of the concerns that you hear is this will, and former Senator Bill Bradley, who was the original sponsor of PASPA, he at post Supreme Court decision, he was quoted. He took issue with the court's ruling and had concerns that now it's going to lead to wagering on high school athletics and amateur athletics. It hasn't happened in Nevada. It's something obviously you want to look for. New Jersey's legislation does not permit wagering on high school athletics, and there's language when it comes to contestants below 18 years old. So I don't see that in practicality playing out, that we'd have wagering on those events, but that's something that each state legislator is going to have to decide. If you talk about minor league games and D-League games, whatever it may be, these are all the things that each legislator has to weigh when it comes to what is offered on the wagering menu, and it will be on a state-by-state basis and what they're comfortable with.
And it would seem to be that there's some legitimate concern about, college games, minor league games, as you mentioned, developmental league games, where the players who are participating in those games are either not being paid at all or are being paid relatively little. And so the thought being that they're the most vulnerable to corruption and bribes and those types of things. Those seem to be legitimate concerns, don't they?
I completely agree. I understand, those viewpoints, and they make sense, right? When you just look at it logically, those are the people that are most susceptible, right? When you talk about the athletes in the professional level that are making millions of dollars, and it's much harder to fix a game with them. There are, if you look at the history of match fixing, it's not just money necessarily. Sometimes it's not only about that. So when a counterpoint to that argument that, well, professional athletes can't be corrupted, well, maybe it's something that there's incriminating photos of them that they don't want their family to see. So it's not as simple as some people want to make it out to be when it comes to the match fixing, and it's something. The integrity of the game issues are. I think they're of paramount concern to everybody involved. It's not, it's obviously the leagues and the people that put on the event, fans, but also the operators. They don't want a situation where there are fixed matches and, they're essentially putting a product on the board that they're being taken for. Sportsbook operators don't like losing money. So I think that, how we get there, what the offerings are, what the best way to go about it is, I think that's a fair discussion, and there's valid points on each side, right? Purists would say, if you look at what's going on now, there's an underground market. It's, aren't we better having everything in the regulated space where we can monitor it? And then you hear from sportsbook operators, and they say, well, we're not going to, allow wagers with no limits, to be placed on these amateur events, and it's all part of essentially smoking out match fixing and point shaving. There are good points on every side of this argument, and that's the tricky, nature of, how do we get to, a point where sports betting is operating most efficiently. And that will take time. That's not going to happen overnight, just because people have to learn it, understand, how the parties can work together. And that will take time. That's not going to happen overnight. So when it comes to those athletes, though, you're absolutely right. I think when you just look at it from the outside, amateur athletes are arguably most susceptible just because of the lack of money or no money at all when you're looking through the NCAA lens. So that's something that's going to have to be watched closely.
Now, Chris, you mentioned the underground market a couple of times, and certainly we know that there is a pretty substantial underground market when it comes to sports betting. Do we have any idea what's the best thinking in terms of how much money each year is being, wagered in the underground market?
There have been estimates, conservative estimates. I've seen it as low as $60 billion. The most aggressive estimates, and this goes back to when Commissioner Silver first started, talking about sports betting and introducing the idea of maybe we're better off in a regulated space. They were as high as $400 billion. The number you keep seeing come up. Throughout as we've gone through this process is somewhere in the $150 billion range that's wagered underground annually. And I think it's important to note, too, and this is another one of the misconceptions, underground includes, the corner bookmaker, that you see in the movies, but
Right.
it also includes offshore operators. Just because they may be licensed in a different country, it's still illegal to wager with those offshore companies if you're in the United States. They take the money, and you can obviously do it, and that's a big part of the underground market. But I was surprised to hear how many people didn't know that was necessarily illegal, that was part of that underground market. So it's made up by both operators, the hand-to-hand as well as the offshore. But it's all, it all encompasses that underground market, and how that underground market is addressed in a regulated space, how you shut down that underground market, what steps you take. That's going to be another fascinating area to watch. And, is it stepped up enforcement, cracking down on these entities? Time will tell. But, I don't think it's going to naturally have this just $150 billion is not just going to naturally move to the regulated space. So, the next few years will be interesting.
Yeah, and that last point, I agree with it, right? I mean, the underground market is not going to dry up, right? First of all. And then there's the question of how much of the money that's currently being spent underground will make its way into the states that move forward with legalized betting. And certainly the states are making a bet, so to speak, that this is going to be a significant revenue generator for them. What about that? Are there projections on the legal side of what this may mean for different states? And I know that must be very difficult to say, state to state, but what are the states realistically looking at from a revenue generation standpoint?
It's going to depend on the state. Obviously, people get excited about the Northeast just given the population. I would caution, you'll see these wild numbers thrown around, and a lot of the time, what's going on is that there's a lack of understanding of the difference between handle and revenue in sports betting. Handle is the total amount of money that comes into the sports book. Sometimes you'll see people talk about that as if that's revenue that the sports books receive, and that's what it's being taxed on. That $150 billion number we talked about, that is handle. That's not revenue. So I think that's an important distinction, because when you hear lawmakers talking about taxing handle, and you see these hundreds of millions of dollars, in revenue, when actually that's the handle. So I think people just need to make sure that they're looking at numbers realistically, and the lawmakers who are entertaining the legislation understand that there is a significant difference between the two. And if you're assuming that you're going to receive tax revenue based on handle, lawmakers will be extremely disappointed, because the way that the laws are typically structured is that it's being taxed on gross gaming revenue, and that's the net essentially of the revenue. So what the sports book actually does end up keeping.
Now, what about the fantasy sports operators, DraftKings and FanDuel? I've seen some reports that one or both of those companies are looking to dip their toe in the water, in the sports gambling water. What are you hearing on that front?
They both are. The day of the decision, I believe, or the day after, DraftKings CEO came out and made clear that they were going to enter the sports betting space. They actually recently announced that they have a partnership with. I apologize. I'm forgetting what casino it is in Atlantic City, but they've partnered with a casino in Atlantic City to operate a physical sports book, because New Jersey's legislation requires that a physical sports book be present within the state at either a casino or a racetrack. So, a DraftKings looks at that as that's their way to use their obviously advanced mobile product, but they needed the physical space. So they partnered with a casino in Atlantic City. FanDuel recently was purchased by Paddy Power. Betfair, which is a London-based company, they have a presence in the state, in this country, and FanDuel will be the sportsbook arm of the reports are that FanDuel will be the named sportsbook for Paddy Power Sportsbooks, and they just signed a deal with Jeff Gorell, who owns the Meadowlands. They will have the physical sportsbook at the Meadowlands in New Jersey, as well as Mr. Gorell's other property in New York, when New York legalizes sports betting, Tioga Downs, which is upstate New York. And so, they're both entering the space. They given FanDuel's purchase and, DraftKings' stated position, they did not hesitate to transition to sports betting in addition to their fantasy products.
Now, Chris, you and I offline, we were talking about the leagues and how their position here has evolved, in terms of the litigation, being opposed to the litigation at first. And you made some interesting points about that progression and that evolution, because now, you see leagues trying to position themselves in such a way to, be able to take advantage of the revenue that may be generated here, which is understandable. But can you just give us a little taste of that progression and that evolution and how that came about, where leagues now, not just the fantasy sports operators, but the leagues also are looking to take advantage of what's going on here?
Sure, and I think that it's not just the revenue; it's also they do have genuine integrity concerns as well. And I think what happened was with the progression of the Christie 2 case, the case that was ultimately decided by the Supreme Court. When the Supreme Court granted cert, that was sort of an upset in many people's views. They didn't think that this case would end up. When I say they, I'm just talking about people at large, not the leagues. I don't think many people thought that this would end up at the Supreme Court, but once the Supreme Court did agree to hear the case, I think that the consensus was that, okay, they're taking this case for a reason. There may be issues with PASPA, and then, when they had the oral argument on December 4th of 2017, if you listen to that oral argument, I think that most people walked away from that oral argument, thinking that New Jersey was in a favorable position. At that point, states started to, and, around that time, states started to hold hearings on sports betting and the potential future, within their borders. And the leagues, some leagues, made the assessment that they should be involved in that conversation. And that's where you see, a league presence at the state level, talking about their concerns. And, from a product standpoint moving forward, I think from an engagement, fan engagement perspective, that will be a benefit to the leagues. With the rise of in-game wagering, that has potential to really help that engagement perspective. So there are a lot of benefits that overall leagues could have, but I think that the concern is also making sure that it's done the right way. And not hastily done where it could create issues moving forward.
Now, Chris, you mentioned something that I think is important to circle back to, and that's in-game wagering. There may be some who are unfamiliar with that and what it means. So why don't you explain that a little bit? And then also, the leagues may have some concerns. Some leagues may have some concerns about in-game wagering. So why don't you take us through both what it is and then some of the concerns that the leagues may have as it relates to in-game wagering?
So in-game wagering is, traditionally, if you're not too familiar with sports betting, traditionally how sports betting works is you bet prior to a contest, and then, based on the outcome, and then there have been times where, let's say in a football game, you can wager on a second half outcome, but it's been pretty much limited to before the game, and then the game plays out, and whatever side you were on of the wager, you either win or lose. In-game wagering provides opportunities to for the bettor to wager during the contest. So a line, use football as the example, at a commercial break, the line may be updated to say, if a team was favored by 7 points pregame, they go right down the field and score. Now the line may be adjusted to 10 points. And in-game opportunities, and they can exist across every sport. That's what that is. And I think the most recent statistics that I saw, I think up to 70% of wagering done in the UK is in-game. So, when you talk about, as I mentioned, that engagement perspective, you're never, if you're betting on the game, you're never out of, you're never losing interest if you're betting in-game, because the lines constantly move, and it can get as granular as, if you go to baseball and, will a run be scored this inning, or, will so-and-so get a hit? I've seen talk about, people have talked about, will the next pitch be a ball or strike? That's getting very granular, and it's not offered in Nevada. The bets that are that, basically, will the next pitch be a ball or strike? But, it is a possibility as technology advances, and those are the types of things that I think the leagues are very concerned with, the integrity issues that could potentially come along with that. Al Leiter was testifying in New Jersey last week prior to, and Al Leiter is, as you know, Jeff, is a former pitcher in baseball. He was testifying before New Jersey committee, and that was the example he was using about, look, it's not influencing the outcome of a game. It can, though, if I throw a ball and my friend places wagers, around the country or at different books, and I throw the ball and then he makes the money off of those wagers. So those are the types of concerns that the leagues have. And it's a concern for the operators as well. Again, they don't want to be losing massive amounts of money on, bets that are easily manipulated. So with in-game, in the more granular it gets, the more opportunity there are for issues. So that's the league's point, but the operators feel the same way as well. And how we get to a point where we're comfortable with in-game, that's something that will play out over time.
And is that something that's also part of the discussions in terms of the scope of the betting that's going to be allowed in each of the states? That will be, something that regulators have to deal with and operators have to deal with. And it has been a discussion point, in hearings with, these, to try to focus, I guess, the conversation on, look, these are concerns. This could happen if we go really narrow on these things. It could be, something that, it's not affecting the outcome, but look, this is something that can happen, and it's essentially it is fixing. So, these are all the things that need to be weighed. Those bets tend to carry very low limits, from an operator perspective, but the technology also has to be there as well, right? When you talk about real time versus live feeds, and the lag behind a you sit at home, there may be a 5-10 second delay on your TV if you're watching a game. To bet something as small as a pitch, the technology really needs to catch up to make that a reality. But it is possible. And you mentioned 70% of the wagering in Europe is on in-game.
Correct. Yeah,
wow.
That's and when you look at UK and they have exchange platforms as well, where that's advanced. I don't think we're going to be there anytime soon, but the exchange platforms differ from the traditional bookmaker and function more like a financial market, and that it's a bid and an ask. So you and I may be on the exchange and we're watching the Giants play the Jets, and you want the Giants at a certain price, and I'll take that wager. It operates the same as a financial market. So it's, there are many opportunities, and that goes on throughout in-game. So it will be, again, we're at square one when it comes to, legalization in this country and how it proceeds. But all you need to do is look across the pond to see, what the potential is for, a fully functioning market and the offerings that are available. And I think people would be pretty shocked with, the product offerings and, what could take place in this country.
And on that front, when I think about in-game wagering, I look at a sport like baseball, and it's interesting that you mentioned Al Leiter, a former major league pitcher, testifying about in-game wagering recently. But when I look at baseball, it seems to me that sport, given the pace of play, which is interesting because that's always that seems to be part of the lexicon over the past 4 or 5 years, pace of game. But when you look at the pace of play in baseball, it would seem to me that perhaps more than the other sports, that would be the one where in-game wagering, because that game sort of unfolds a little bit more slowly, where in-game wagering could be popular.
I think that in-game can be popular across the board. The time that I've spent out in Nevada doing some work, I hear a lot about basketball in-game, and that's a product that people really seem to enjoy. But you're 100% correct. Obviously baseball has made an effort to address pace of play issues. Look, in-game wagering is not going to be for everybody for obvious reasons, but I do think that when it comes to those types of wagers, will a run be scored this inning? Will so and so get a hit? Will they strike out? An updated run line, whatever it is, I do agree that baseball has potential to benefit, just given the inherent pace of play issues, and that may lend itself to benefiting baseball because you have more time to think about the wager you're going to make. Right? There's time in between innings. A line could be posted. It's not an instant decision that needs to be made. You have a few minutes to say, okay, do I want to wager on this? So for the people that want to partake in that, I do think that it helps baseball from that pace of play concern. But that's when you also get into making sure that there's no issue with the wagers being offered, and that's the discussion that's taking place, and the feeling out as to what everybody's comfortable with, and how we move forward. So. But you're 100% right. It is a tool to potentially address pace of play issues.
Now, Chris, you've gone on record and you've even mentioned it here in our conversation today that you believe that it's much better for the wagering to be legalized, right? And so that this way it can be regulated. But are there any downsides to legalized betting? Any downsides for youth or in any other respect to legalized betting?
Yeah, I listen, that's a valid concern. And I think that the one that jumps out, immediately is potential for problem gamblers. If you go back to the daily fantasy movement, essentially in 2015, the advertising blitz that both those companies went on. When I say both those companies, DraftKings and FanDuel, where you couldn't watch a game or turn on a TV without seeing a DraftKings or FanDuel ad. Do we end up in a position where now it's bookmakers that are flooding the airways, and you have kids watching that? All legitimate concerns. I think that, me personally, I go back to the fact that there's a massive underground market, and, especially when it comes to problem gamblers, I'm of the mindset that problem gamblers are gambling, and in an unregulated space, the safeguards are not in place to potentially help people like that. In a regulated space, they are. You have money that's set aside for problem gamblers. Bookmakers are required to have ad campaigns to address problem gambling. Operators are taught, how to identify problem gambling. So, I just think that, given the state of where we are and the size of the underground market, that money is much better in the regulated space. It's taxed, it's transparent, it's easier to monitor, and I think that for the minority that will have issues with gambling, there are programs in place. It's like anything, Jeff. I mean, alcohol is legal. You have people that are alcoholics. People are addicted to scratch-offs, and people play the lottery. People get mixed up in drugs. Unfortunately, anything that can be addictive, you're going to have people that, unfortunately, have issues with it. But I think that given the prevalence of it, those people are better off with a regulated market. And, I just think that that's the better way to handle it at this point. And it sounds like most people agree with that, just knowing, the size of what currently exists and what goes on.
All right, Chris, and I'm going to ask you now to pull out your crystal ball. And
I'm not good at this, so.
How do you see things unfolding here, both in the short term and the long term, as states move in? For example, do you anticipate Congress passing legislation, or do you think this will remain a state by state issue, and with some states getting in and some states not? How do you see this unfolding if you were to have to predict today based on what you see out there?
So I would lean towards, let me put it this way, I think that it will be a state-by-state issue. If Congress acts, I think it will be to set minimum standards for the states, and then it's the state's responsibility to decide what they want to do with gaming, what they're comfortable with. But if Congress acts, it will be to set minimum standards that each state must follow. So that's the first part. Second part, I think we'll have, like I said, I think we'll see four states, most likely, Nevada, Delaware, West Virginia, Mississippi, five potentially, obviously New Jersey, have sports betting by the fall. There are estimates within 5 years we can have up to 32 states. How the legislation and regulations that are adopted work, when it comes to tax rates, product offerings, will there be mobile? Will it all be land-based? How convenient do you want to make the product for the consumer? That's anybody's guess. But I do think it will be done at the state level. But I think that there will be a feeling out period. Pennsylvania has adopted legislation that would pave the way to legalize sports betting, but the tax rate is, close to 40%. And that's after a $10 million licensing fee. To give you context, the tax rate in Nevada is roughly 6.75%. So, you'll have this feeling out period where mistakes will be made because it's not viable when it comes to, having a tax rate that high and fees associated with the cost. So short term, I think that's what we're looking at. Long term, what will be interesting to see is, for instance, is the Wire Act, at the federal level, the Wire Act of 1961, prohibits interstate wagering. So, I didn't really address it earlier, but all of these states, this is, happening state by state. You will have to be physically located within that state to wager. Even with a mobile product, Nevada has mobile now, and there's geofencing. Essentially, when you leave the state, they know you left the state, you can't wager with the sports book. So until the Wire Act is addressed, we will not have interstate wagering. I think that may prohibit some growth when it comes to the industry. It will be interesting to see if that's addressed. I mentioned the exchange betting, and will those types of products be available? It's too early to see. Paddy Power has a platform. It's not like their sports book business, but they have the BetPair platform. That will be interesting. Will a state be progressive and not require a sports book operator to be associated with a casino or racetrack? That time will tell. I think that once you remove the requirement that you be tied to those properties, you obviously will have more entrants to the market. So that's something to watch. And I also think, just from a more general sports fan and consumer perspective, what happens with media? And that's been something that's been talked about a lot. How are games covered? I don't see us ever getting to a point where the play-by-play people are talking about lines in the booth, and a touchdown covering a spread, or hitting an over or an under. I do think you will have supplemental programming that deals with that. I think that you'll have more shows pop up that may be gambling related. ESPN, on their ESPN Plus product, recently launched a show in conjunction with the Action Network, which is a Peter Chernin company that's run by a former editor of ESPN, Chad Millman. He handled ESPN Chalk, which is their betting site. They now have a show that it looks similar to PTI almost, pardon the interruption, but that's on their ESPN Plus platform. So, will that programming become more prevalent? I think it will. I don't think it will bleed into the broadcast, but, time will tell. And, it will be interesting to see how that evolves as well. So I think we're in for a fascinating, next 5 to 10 years to see how this actually develops. And, I think the safe bet is we stand here today talking, the conversation will be much different, even 2-3 years down the road, but definitely 5 to 10 years, we're going to be in a market that it looks much different than it does today.
Yeah, and you hit the nail on the head. I mean, it's very interesting. It's very fascinating. It's intriguing, and it's worth watching. And so, Chris, I want to thank you for joining us today to talk about the ins and outs of sports gambling, and we'll see where it goes. And before I let you go, I just want to tell those who are listening that you also through Excalibur are heavily involved in salary arbitration, and we've appeared on opposite sides of the table in the past, and
that's correct.
I'm sure we'll appear on opposite sides of the table in the future. But certainly later this year, I would love to have you come back, and we can talk about salary arbitration. But for today, the discussion on sports gambling has really been enlightening, and I want to thank you for that. And as I look forward to our conversation maybe later in the year, I just want to again thank you for taking some time today.
Sure. Yeah, it's nice to actually have a conversation outside of a hearing room. So it was a lot of fun, and I appreciate you having me on. And we will talk again. It sounds like a plan.
Yeah, sure does. So thanks again for joining us, Chris Cipolla. That was a fascinating discussion on one of the hottest topics in the sports world. Chris Cipolla provided a wealth of information on the subject of sports gambling that I trust you found enlightening. A few hours after our interview on June 11, New Jersey Governor Phil Murphy signed a bill legalizing sports betting in the Garden State. As Chris noted, other states are sure to follow suit, and we'll be keeping an eye on it. In the meantime, if you liked what you heard today, be sure to subscribe on whatever platform you choose: iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, TuneIn, YouTube, you name it, and encourage your friends to subscribe as well. Until then, you know what time it is now. Time for Scully to take us home. But we'll be back soon with another edition of Sports 360, and we hope to catch you then. Later.
Scully.